Hello. In this lecture, the main topic will concern philosophical theories of identity in general, personal identity in particular, and in even more particular, Locke's view of personal identity. The first thing I want to mention is that, like in some previous units, the textbook here in the middle of things kind of takes a bit of a left turn at Albuquerque and addresses a philosophical issue that is in some ways related to the way it started, but in other ways is not really related to the way it started and is really a distinct question. And that happens here to, I think, a greater degree than even happened in the unit on free will and personal responsibility and all that. So up until this point, up until section 3.4, the text has been concerned with the nature of mind, like what is a mind, and has primarily examined the view that has become common in the Western world since about Plato, that the mind is its own kind of substance, it's its own kind of stuff, whether you want to call it soul or spirit or mind stuff or what have you. That's the view. Right? It talks a lot about that view and how that view sort of changes and influences philosophy over time, even up until the days of Descartes, where Descartes sort of re-explains it in a sort of characteristically modern way, although the view itself is really quite ancient. And so again, the topic in that section of the text is the nature of mind. What is a mind? And the text will go back to that topic in sections 3.9 and 3.10. But there's a little section in the middle here where we're looking at something else. In these sections, in section 3.5 and 3.6, the main topic is personal identity, which again sometimes kind of touches the notion of what a mind is, but not really. It's really a distinct issue. That doesn't mean it's not interesting and it's not worthwhile. It's just it is different, and so I think it's worth making a note that that's going on. Otherwise, it's, I think, harder to keep straight what's really going on here. So in order to help you get a clearer picture of what's going on, I think a little bit of context is necessary. So first, let's take a look at the concept of identity all by itself, because this is one of those cases where the way that we very commonly use a word in everyday life is very different than the way philosophers use that very same word. And in this case, the word is identity or identical. And so when philosophers are talking about identity in the context of metaphysics, we define identity as the relation that things have with themselves only. Okay, so if I'm a thing, then the only thing that is me is me. That is the only thing I bear the identity relation to. There is one and only one thing in the entire universe that is identical with me, and that's me. There is only one thing in the world that is identical with my laptop, and that is my laptop. There are other laptops that are exactly similar, right? That rolled off this, the factory assembly line, having very all similar properties, right? Exactly similar components, but they are not the same. There's only one object that is my laptop, one thing that it is identical with it, and that's the identity relation, right? It's the relation that things have with themselves only. Okay, and so let's contrast that with some everyday usages of the term identity. So for example, when people talk about identity politics, right, they refer to the kinds of issues that are sometimes shared by people of a common geographical region or a common socioeconomic class or a common racial experience or something like that. So when those kinds of interests are shared by groups, sometimes we'll refer to that kind of thing as identity politics. It's not identity in the sense that philosophers use it in metaphysics. It's the same word, yes, but it's just a different usage, and so it's neither here nor there with respect to the philosophical controversy. Similarly, with someone's, let's say, gender identity or sexual identity or something like that. So when we say that someone identifies as a man or identifies as a woman, we don't mean philosophical, metaphysical identity in those cases either, even though, again, it is the same word. Words get used for lots of different things. That's normal. That's natural. But I just wanted to draw a distinction here. So, for example, when someone used to identify, for example, as a man, now identifies as a woman, philosophically, we say that they are the same person, right? That is, that they are themselves, right? They could point to a photograph before they began identifying themselves differently and say, "Oh, that's still me," right? It's just before I identified as a different gender or something like that. So again, the term identity is not the same as the metaphysical term in each of those contexts. Also, this is one that actually annoys me a little bit, even though it shouldn't, that when people talk about identical twins, and I'm like, no, there's no such thing as identical twins. Philosophically, there isn't. But again, it really is a usage of the language that people really do use. What they really ought to say, in my view, is they should say they're exactly similar twins, right? Because there are two of them, right? If there are two people, they cannot be the same person. And the only way that they could be identical is, so like Batman and Bruce Wayne are identical. That is, there's one person. But twins are not identical. There's two of them, so they are exactly similar twins. But this is pickiness if you're familiar with the way that philosophers use the term. So, for example, the other day I had a coworker come up to me and say, "Oh, I almost wore that same sweater today." I was like, "No, you didn't. You were nowhere near my closet. You almost wore an exactly similar sweater. It's not the same, right?" So again, philosophers really want to draw a distinction between similarity and sameness, and that really will make a difference here. But that's how philosophers use the word identity. Identity refers to the relation that things have with themselves only. And so let's talk now a little bit about object identity, and that'll help us sort of slide our way into some of the controversies surrounding personal identity so that you have a little bit more context when you read some of this material. So the big example that everybody always uses about object identity, it's because it's a good example, is the ship of Theseus. And when I say everybody, I mean philosophers for literally thousands of years have been using this example in one way or another to illustrate something about the metaphysics of identity. And so here's the way it goes. And I'm going to use my I'm going to get my laser pointer out here to walk through the image here. And so again, imagine this is the ship of Theseus. That is Theseus's ship. Theseus was a mythological ancient Greek hero who was most famous for slaying the Minotaur. Okay, that's the sort of half bull, half man that lives in the labyrinth and all that business. You can look up the stories. So anyway, in order to be an ancient Greek hero, you need a ship, and Theseus was an ancient Greek hero, so he had a ship that he sailed around on, doing all the heroing that he did. Okay, great. Now imagine that right after Theseus retires, you've got the ship. Okay, and the ship of Theseus Preservation Society takes over, custodianship of this ship, and just imagine that what they do is that, as the time goes by, right, a year later, they just replace one of the planks of wood in the ship with an exactly similar but different plank of wood, right? They just replace it, right? And then the next year they replace another one, and then the next year they replace another one, and so, again, you might imagine this is similar to what goes on as the ship just goes through its natural life. Stuff gets replaced, stuff wears out, or whatever. But in this case, we're just replacing a plank here or there for reasons. And so eventually, once you get to, say that the ship is made of 1,000 planks of wood, by the time you get to, year 1,000, you've got this ship, and let's call it ship A for short, for some reasons that'll become clear in a minute. This is the ship that's the result of having, over a very long period of time, all 1,000 planks replaced, right? And I think, if that's all that's going on, I think there's no point at which we're willing to say that just like, whoop, nope, it's not the ship of Theseus anymore. I mean, sometimes people might think it's like, oh, well, gosh, when you've got that 501st plank, then all of a sudden it's majority, not the original parts or something like that. That's tempting, but really you'd have to say that there's something magic about that 501st plank, even if you're picking it at random, that's like, no, that's the one, that's the plank that makes it the ship of Theseus. That just doesn't sound plausible, right? If replacing one plank doesn't make it not the ship of Theseus anymore, then replacing another plank shouldn't do it either. It's just a difference of one plank. And so again, imagine somebody in year 3 or 4 or something like that coming saying, "Hey, I hear you guys have the ship of Theseus." What would you tell them? You say, "Well, you should have come here 3 or 4 years ago before we changed a plank, because it's gone. Like, it's been completely destroyed. There's no ship of Theseus." I mean, I don't know that any of us would be really tempted to say that. And so, again, ship A does seem to have some reasonable claim at being the ship of Theseus. But notice we instead, right, of replacing a plank, you could just set one aside. Right. And so imagine in year one, you set one plank aside, and then in year two, you set another plank aside, you take it out of the ship and then put it somewhere else. And then after 1,000 years, you've got 1,000 planks of wood. Well, what could you do with 1,000 planks of wood? Well, you could make a ship with them. Right. And so then you go ahead and put them together, and you've got what we're going to be calling ship B here, which is made from the reassembly of all those planks that you just set aside over 1,000 years. And it seems like in year 1,000, if somebody comes and says, "Hey, I hear you have the ship of Theseus," you're like, "Yeah, we do again. We've taken it apart slowly, but now here it is again, right? It's ship, here it is. Here's the ship of Theseus." And it seems like that's, again, has a really good claim to be the ship of Theseus, except that you could do both of these processes all at the same time, and that means you could end up with both ship A and ship B at the end of this process. And then the question is, okay, which one's really the ship of Theseus? And it seems like there's a real controversy here for the following reason. That ship A has continuity going in its favor, right? So like you could have stopped in at any point over the last 1,000 years and said, "Hey, where's the ship of Theseus?" And you'd say, "Oh, it's right there. There you can see it," right? Whereas you've got, because you've got this thing, it's continuously been a ship the entire time. Whereas here you've just got an ever-growing, stack of wood, and that then sort of becomes a ship later, or stops being a ship pretty quickly and then becomes a ship later. Ship B though has originality in its favor. Like all the planks of wood that comprise ship B really did comprise the ship at year 0. But of course, the downsides of each of these views is that ship A has, despite the fact that it has continuity, has no originality. It doesn't have any of the original parts. B, despite having all the original parts, it has no continuity. It has no history of being the ship of Theseus. And so there's a real dispute as to which of those things are more important for the identity of an object, and it's not at all clear which is which. You might have some intuitions where you think one is more clear than the other, but I mean, really, is there a rational basis for preferring one or the other? It's somewhat less clear, and that's why it's an issue in metaphysics. So one of the things that you can notice, you can't really solve this by saying that there's some sort of intermediate position, right? You can't say, well, they're both the ship of Theseus. Well, because if A is the ship of Theseus and B is the ship of Theseus, then A is B, right? Again, being like the is of identity here, and it's clearly not the case. A cannot be the same as B because there are two of them, right? These two things cannot both be identical with the ship of Theseus because things can be identical with themselves only, right? If there's two of them, they're not identical. So those are some of the issues we run into, and those are some of the issues with object identity anyway that we run into. Now let's take one more step and go to personal identity. So personal identity is just what it sounds like. Is like it's the idea that a person is the same person over time and through change. And I think we all have, photographs of ourselves when we were younger and say, hey, that's me when I was 8, or that's me when I was 13, or whatever. Just like here we have a photograph of Tom Hanks when he was very young, and Tom Hanks more or less now when he's much older. It's like you want to say, look, they're the same person. Well, if you're saying that, what you're saying is that there is an identity relation that they bear to each other, that there's one person and not two. There's not a past person who is distinct from the present person in terms of identity. And most ideas of personal identity focus on continuity rather than originality, because human beings do change over time. They change physically and they change psychologically. If you think, what do I have in common with myself when I was 8? Well, probably, physically nothing. In fact, if you would have been a really bizarre looking 8-year-old if you had the same body now as when you were 8 as you do now. I mean, not to say that there should be anything wrong with the way you look now. I'm just saying that, if you looked like that as an 8-year-old, that would have been very unusual. But it's a different body. It's changed over time. And of course, you don't think the same way you think when you were 8, or at least I hope not. We should all hope not. And so again, there's psychological change over time. And that's really where the controversy in personal identity comes from. We do have the very strong sense that there is such a thing as personal identity. The question that creates the controversy is what kind of continuity? Continuity of what? Is it continuity of body? Is the thing that makes you the same as the person in that photograph of you when you were younger? Is it that you have a body that has undergone these continuous changes, like ship A and the ship of Theseus, over a long period of time? There's really incremental little changes. Or is the difference that your psychology has undergone these little incremental tiny changes, again, like ship A and the ship of Theseus, over a long period of time between then and now? In fact, these are the two most common views of what grounds personal identity. It's either continuity of body or continuity of psychology, or that is, psychological properties. So bodily identity is the view that people are their bodies. And we use this view all the time when we recognize each other. So, for example, if you agree to meet your friend at a restaurant for lunch, and then you get there and you wonder if your friend has gotten there before you, the first thing you do is you look around for their body, and you assume that when you see their body that they got there before you did. Okay, so you assume in some sense that they are their body, right? You feel like that's good enough evidence when you see their body. That's it, right? Question done. There they are. And so again, we use it all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean we use it reflectively, right, in a way that really makes sense or that really holds up to scrutiny, but we do in fact use it all the time. I will say this view is vulnerable to replacement arguments, which we'll talk about on a subsequent slide. The other common view of personal identity is psychological identity. That's what it's called. And that is the view that people are a continuity of their psychological properties rather than a continuity of any sort of bodily properties that they have. And we kind of use this view all the time whenever physical cues are unavailable. So imagine getting a phone call from somebody and you don't immediately recognize their voice, but you can't like see them, right? Just being a phone call, or like a text. Let's say you get a new phone and you lose all your contacts or something, and then you get a text from somebody. Well, I mean, based on the way they talk, the things they mention, these sorts of clues as to their sort of personality and psychological state, the things that they believe, the things that they think are important, the ways in which they express them, those are all clues to say, okay, who is this, right? And so we use those all the time. Security passwords, as like security questions. Those are the kinds of things that rely on something like a psychological view of identity. Now, again, we don't really adopt these views reflectively, right? Maybe there's something wrong with them, but we do use them all the time. The psychological identity view is unfortunately vulnerable to what are called duplication arguments, which again I'll discuss here in a minute. So first, with the major view with the bodily identity view, the bodily identity view, as I mentioned just a moment ago, is vulnerable to replacement arguments. And you see these like sort of scattered all over the philosophical literature. You don't have to read very many different pieces about personal identity before you'll come into some version or other of a replacement argument. And so here's how it might work. And I want to use a sort of a fictional character as a kind of example, right, to talk through how the replacement argument kind of works. And I'm going to use a familiar character, although, well, both familiar and unfamiliar. So I think most Americans especially are familiar with the Tin Man from the movie The Wizard of Oz. Now, I'm going to be referring to the Tin Man from the book, which is less familiar to people, but is, you could call it the same character, but there are definitely some differences. And so in the books, the Tin Man actually has a name. His name is Nick Chopper, but he's in the film only referred to as the Tin Man, right? But of course, in the books, he's a Tin Woodman. Woodman is his occupation. He's a lumberjack. Okay, and so his backstory, which occurs in one of the later books, I want to say the 12th or 13th Oz book, somewhere in there. You get this idea of how he came to be the Tin Man, right? He wasn't always made of tin. But the story is that he falls in love with a Munchkin girl named Nimmy, and the mean old woman with whom Nimmy lives disapproves of that match and then asks the Wicked Witch of the East, remember that's the one that the house falls onto, Dorothy's house, and who this witch then enchants Chopper's axe, which he uses for his job, right? He's a lumberjack, he cuts down trees. the axe sort of dismembers him. So and as the axe like cuts pieces of himself off, right, he goes to a tinsmith, and the tinsmith makes prosthetics for him until he is sort of all prosthetic. He's all tin, or rather steel coated with tin or something like that. Anyway. In such a case, right? So the idea is that just imagine something like this happening, and you don't necessarily have to imagine it in a fantasy world. You could imagine, somebody accidentally losing a part of their body in an accident and then having that replaced with a prosthetic, and so on and so on. And just imagine that our prosthetics technology is, somewhat more effective than it is, especially when you talk about prosthetic heads and prosthetic torsos and stuff like that. But that's the idea, right? He just has his body replaced with different parts, okay, and continues doing his job, continues saying, oh, I fell in love once upon a time with this Munchin girl named Nimmy, and having a continuous history and all that sort of stuff, and so what it seems like is we've got the same fellow, Nick Chopper, the whole time, yet we've completely replaced the body. And what those kinds of thought experiments indicate is that maybe what we really think is important about personal identity is not the body at all, even though we sometimes, as a shortcut, use that as a criterion for identifying people. So this is the way the replacement argument works. It argues that identity can survive the replacement of the body, and so then that means that seems to be, in those kinds of thought experiments, evidence that makes the bodily theory of identity, makes it look kind of bad. So that's how replacement arguments generally work. So notice that replacement arguments make the psychological theory of identity look pretty good, also by contrast, because the idea is when you replace the whole body, well, what's left, right? What's the same with Nick Chopper over time as he gets various pieces of himself replaced? Well, what's the same is his memories, his thoughts, his emotions, right? The way that he acts, the way that he thinks, the things that he believes, the things that he remembers, all that sort of stuff, all those psychological things seem to be consistent, even though all the physical stuff gets changed out. And so those replacement arguments tend to make the bodily argument of identity look bad and the psychological theory look good. Well, in comes duplication arguments, which are going to in turn make the psychological theory actually look pretty bad. And actually, I'm going to use the same character, oddly enough, essentially the same story. This is a photograph of the cover of the Tin Woodman of Oz. You'll notice two tin people here, right? There's, of course, your Tin Woodman, who's got like his woodsman's axe right here, that's the familiar character. And then, of course, you've got this other tin person here who's carrying a sword and got kind of a funny hat on. This is sort of the Tin Soldier. And in fact, the Tin Soldier's proper name is Captain Fighter, right? And he's a tin soldier that they sort of find in one of these later Oz books. And he has a very similar backstory to the Tin Woodman, to Nick Chopper. So he also falls in love with Nimmy, this same Munchin girl. And, look, what works one time can work a second time. And so this guy gets cursed by the Wicked Witch of the East, and he is dismembered and chopped up into pieces by his own sword, and so this should maybe tell you to be careful of your romantic entanglements if your job involves carrying something sharp, particularly if you live in a place where there are witches. So anyway, the body, all the, so he, and again, just like the Tin Woodman, gets all of his parts, replaced by tin, and the tinsmith, of course, is, doing good business here. So as it turns out, because this is a fantasy world, the body parts of Chopper and Fighter, they're all just in a barrel at the tinsmith's place, right? You bring him in, it's like, okay, leg, measure it, throw it in a barrel, make the tin, there you go. And so so when they sort of visit the tinsmith, this is the Chopper and Fighter, right? Then they visit the tinsmith and they notice that like all of their old body parts are all just thrown in a barrel, except they're not all there. Some of them are sort of missing, and it turns out that the tinsmith had put some of them together. That's actually what's depicted in this picture down here. He'd sort of taken random body parts, some from Chopper, some from Fighter, and then had sort of thrown them together. And this includes Captain Fighter's old head, right? And so he put that sort of on this body to make an assistant, and he called that assistant Chop Fight. Okay, and so That's sort of, again, part of the story that they all discover at some point, while they're essentially on their way to find Nimmies, to sort of allow Nimmy to choose between them, right? Because they both think, yeah, you know what, let's give this another go. We're made of tin, right? What else could go wrong? And the Wicked Witch of the East is dead. So anyway, they when they do finally find Nimmy, they discover that she has in fact married Chopfight, who has who had since left his job as the tinsmith's assistant. And so anyway, it's a very strange story. And there's a period where Chopper talks to his own dismembered head and has quite an interesting sort of exchange with it. Very strange. But in any case, I wanted to point out a couple of things. And so the first thing to point out is that Chopfight is psychologically identical with Captain Fighter, right? Because he's got his head, he's got his brain and everything like that. And so they've got the same, or at least up to a certain point, the same memories. They have the same, sort of basic psychological construction. And if you don't think that's plausible, just imagine it is, right? This is a thought experiment. It's, and of course, the Nick Chopper's old head, which is in the barrel, again, is psychologically identical with the Tin Woodman, at least up to a certain point, has all the same memories. And imagine like right after the separation there, you've got again, the same psychology, right? If you ask them the same question, they'd give you the same answer. They have all the same beliefs, desires, all that sort of stuff. And so when you see that, like, is it possible for two different beings, right, to have the same beliefs? Sure. Is it possible for them to have the same memories? It seems sure. Yeah, why not? And so it looks like psychological properties really can be duplicated. But because identity, by definition, can't be duplicated. Remember, if there are two things, they cannot be identical, right? All of those two facts put together make the psychological identity theory look pretty bad, right? So the idea that psychology can be duplicated, but identity by definition can't be, means that saying that identity is grounded in psychology starts to look pretty bad in these kinds of thought experiments. And so this is a real trick, because if the bodily identity view looks pretty bad due to replacement arguments, and the psychological identity view looks pretty bad due to duplication arguments, it seems like it's either neither of those things, and if that's the case, well, what else could it be? Or maybe there is no such thing as identity, but we really do think that there is, right? We have this very strong idea that when you can say, hey, this is what I did yesterday, or this is what I did last year, or that's me when I was 8, or something like that. So it's a real mystery, and it's a lot of fun to take a look at some of this literature. And so now, at long last, we come to Locke's view of identity. And Locke's view of identity is going to be a famous one, right? It's kind of a benchmark for a particular way of looking at things. And I want you to notice a couple of things as you read through it. Notice first off that Locke's view of personal identity definitely rejects the bodily view of identity. And honestly, you can see a little bit of a flavor of a replacement argument in here, right? So think of our example, right? So here's what Locke writes. He says, cut off a hand and thereby separate it from the consciousness, right, that the person, right, whose hand it was, had of its heat, cold, and other affections, and then it is no longer a part of that which is himself any more than the remotest part of matter. Thus we see the substance whereof personal self consisted at one time may be varied at another without the change of personal identity, there being no question about the same person, though the limbs which but now were a part of it be cut off, right? And so he says, again, you can make all kinds of changes in the substance, that is the body, the physical stuff, without necessarily, again, turn somebody from flesh and blood into tin. And, again, as long as their consciousness in some sense persists through all this, there they are. And so he does reject the bodily view and uses something very much like the replacement argument to do so. And of course, his view is a version of psychological identity, because he focuses on memory, which is one kind of psychological property that a person can have. Of course, your beliefs, your desires, your propensities, all those things are also psychological properties. But Locke focuses on memory specifically. He thinks that memory is the most important of these with respect to identity. And he says it this way. He says, as far as this consciousness can be extended backwards, so consciousness of events back in time, that's memory, right? To any past action or thing, so far reaches the identity of that person. It is the same self now it was then, and it is by the same self with this present one that now reflects on it that the action was done. Okay, so again, very much focused on memory, continuity of memory as really grounding what makes personal identity what it is, what makes a person the same over time, right? Is this sort of continuity of memory. Now, of course, like any philosophical view, it does come in for its share of criticism, and maybe it stands up to that criticism, and maybe it doesn't. I will say this, though. One of the most thorough examinations of something like Locke's view of identity that's been written, recently enough, occurs in John Perry's work called A Dialogue on Personal Identity and Immortality. It's about 30-ish pages, and it's really super good. It's written in dialogue form, that is, as a conversation between characters, and I'd say it's one of the very best things written about identity in the last 200 years. It's really outstanding. I would highly recommend, if you're interested in these kinds of issues, taking a look at it, looking it up, seeing if you can find a copy somewhere. I'm sure there's probably some floating around the internet, and there's probably a few you could purchase a little booklet or whatever. This is the photograph here is a photograph of a booklet that I know is for sale in some places. But you, again, could probably find the text of it elsewhere. And so I'm going to just summarize one criticism of Locke's view, and that criticism is covered in John Perry's dialogue here, but I'm going to treat it fairly briefly. And so the thought experiment goes this way. So just imagine that there are two individuals, two people. One person, one of those two people, you're not sure which just by looking at them, really remembers being Biff. And so let's call this person Biff. And the other one seems to remember being Biff, right? So perhaps has, through some kind of hypnosis or, neural hacking or whatever it is, tell yourself any story you like. He seems to remember being Biff, but of course doesn't actually have Biff's memories. So maybe imagine somebody with, some form of mental illness, like believes that they're Napoleon, right? Well, if you ask such a person about, what they did at the Battle of Waterloo, they'll say all kinds of things about what they did at the Battle of Waterloo. Again, they don't remember being at the Battle of Waterloo. They only seem to, and because they're not Napoleon. And so the idea is that, again, you've got two people here. One of them remembers being Biff. The other only seems to remember being Biff. One of them is Biff. One of them is, we should say, is pseudo-Biff, right? Pseudo being a prefix meaning false, right? And so, but again, we're going to stipulate that you can't tell the difference just by looking at them. And of course, how would you tell the difference? This is worth, pausing the video and thinking about it for a minute. Because if you say, okay, well, let's ask them something that only Biff would know. Well, if you ask one of them that question, they'll tell you what they remember, and the other one will tell you what they seem to remember, which will be exactly the same thing. Otherwise, they wouldn't even seem to remember being Biff if they didn't actually have, So again, if you ask them about events that they say they'll both going to say the exact same thing. And so again, what is the real difference? And it's at this point that Perry points out that something like Locke's account, that is using memory to establish identity, which is what Locke appears to do, might sort of be circular, because when you face situations like this one where you duplicate the memory. So again, notice you'll see a flavor of duplication argument in this, which makes sense because Locke has a version of a psychological identity theory. So Locke here, right, says that memory is what establishes identity, right? It's a person's memory that makes personal identity what it is. But the way that you tell the difference between Biff and pseudo-Biff is that you say, well, look, Biff is the one who really remembers, right? Really remembers being Biff, and the other one isn't a Biff, and that's why he only seems to remember. And so if you're doing it that way, then you're using identity to establish memory. But you can't do both of those things on pain of circularity. You can't say, no, it's memory that establishes identity, and then also say, no, it's identity that establishes memory, without, it's a little bit like sweeping the dirt, sort of, under a rug, and saying, yes, I cleaned up, and you're like, no, there's the dirt under the rug. So you sweep it under a different rug and say, no, it's not, right? I cleaned it up, and you're like, well, but it's under this rug now. You sweep it back under the first one. Say, yeah, no, I cleaned up. I mean, so you just keep shuffling around. It's not really a solution to anything. So that's a criticism, certainly, of Locke's view, and it's one of several that could be made. But again, notice it has a flavor of duplication argument about it. The last thing I wanted to mention about concepts of personal identity is that, just like some of the views on the nature of minds that we're going to be taking a look at in the next area of this unit, we're going to, in some sense, not rely at all upon the notions of spirit, soul, or mind stuff, because it doesn't really help, right? And in a very similar way as those things don't really help and actually create a lot of problems for our theories of mind, they would also create problems for our theories of identity. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of those reasons is that you can't really see or sense souls, and so you don't know what has one and what doesn't. And so if you wanted to establish identity on that basis, it's hard to say on what basis you're attributing soulness or sameness of soul to any object over time, because of course you can't tell. And the second, you can't really tell if you, for example, get a similar but again, similar in terms of its qualities, but actually a different soul once in your life. Like, say, when you turn 37 3/4 or something like that. It's like, oh, now you get a new soul that is exactly similar to the previous one. It's just it's just a different one. It's a little bit like replacing a jacket that you wore for a long time with an exactly similar jacket. It's a different jacket, looks the same, smells the same, all that sort of stuff. You wouldn't be able to tell. Except that jackets you really can actually see and smell, but souls you can't. And so that's why you can't really tell when you get a different one, or if you get a different one, or if you get a different one time, or every 5 minutes, or every 5 seconds. And it's one of the things that doesn't help us with respect to theories of identity. And so talk about these sort of spirit, soul, mind stuff, just like it doesn't help us in our theories of mind, also doesn't help us in our theories of identity. And so in the next lecture, we'll be taking a look at sort of the second view of identity. One of the possible solutions to our troubles is to say that in answer to the kinds of troubles we have with both bodily and psychological identity, perhaps there just is no such thing. But notice that's a really tall order that tries to convince us of something that we think on its face sort of sounds absurd, but Hume is going to try and give it a very good try.